Hello everyone. Today is the 10th of April 2024, and what a difference a person makes. Sometimes we think that we can't do anything about what is happening, but one person is actually making it possible for us to become aware of many things that without his contribution we might not have been able to. I was listening to Tucker Carlson yesterday. He was interviewing a pastor, a Palestinian pastor, a Christian Protestant pastor, and about the plight of Christians in Palestine and what is going on and so on. And this pastor has actually, in the name of his church, which I don't remember at the moment, but he has the word evangelical there. And he was telling stories and anecdotes about how difficult it is, because a lot of people come and ask him, well, explain this evangelical. He has to explain that he has no direct connection with the Congress of the United States and the evangelicals there and so on. But anyway, he told us about they are not doing well like the rest of the population. For example, one of the oldest churches, I think is the third oldest church in Christianity, from the 2nd or the 3rd century, was destroyed, hit by a missile. This is horrifying to me because, I mean, if you go back to the 2nd or 3rd centuries, Christians were still being hounded down by Roman emperors and fed to the lions and so on. So this church there, no more, after so many centuries. He was also saying the other denominations too. For example, in the Catholic Church, 2 women were coming out, and then 2 soldiers shot them dead, point blank, right there in the church. Oh, he was saying also how one of his parishioners said to him that a lot of people were coming into the churches because this woman said, if I'm going to be killed anyway, I'd rather be killed here inside the church rather than out there somewhere. Anyway, it was so the reason I say what a difference a person can make is that, okay, let's say, for example, Elon Musk. I don't follow him or anything. I just know that he is the electric cars and all these other things that he does. But he certainly bought Twitter with the expectation that he would make it that he would create a platform available for everybody. Now, a lot of people say no, he didn't go far enough. A lot of people are happy with him, others are not happy, so, most people somewhere in between. But what is true is that he made it available for Tucker Carlson after he was fired by Fox, to have a platform there to interview people who would perhaps we wouldn't have been able to listen to, long interviews and so on. And then, of course, then he went on to create his own network and so on. But he still posts things in Twitter. And so what I find is that he is interviewing people, as I said, that we wouldn't otherwise be able to listen to. For example, with this Christian pastor, the mainstream media is really not interviewing people who perhaps we should be hearing from. And so he is making a difference, I think. But in any case, the reason why it caught my attention is also because I was going to do a video, if you remember, on the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Remember that I did. Okay, let me go back just for a minute to the whole thing here. I posted a video. I told you that I wanted to do 2 videos on 2 women leaders, just to compare them with the leaders today, and these 2 women, what they did. Yeah. And I posted a video on Catherine the Great of Russia, and I chose Russia and Spain because of having certain things in common. One of them, the obvious one, geographical. They are at the periphery of Europe, each one of them. And so I chose Catherine the Great of Russia, and then Queen Isabella of Spain, from the 15th century, Catherine the Great from the 18th century. Very different women. But anyway, I posted the Catherine the Great one. Then I posted the first part of Isabella. I was going to do just one, but it took me a long time to explain the woman, what had formed her, what were her first experiences, and so on. And you remember, I'll put it at the end of the video. You will have the link there. And how, for example, from the age of 8, he had to look after her mother, who was half insane, they said. He was probably also suffering from grave depression, as I explained. So the video went on for too long, and I didn't get to the main point, which was the one event for which she is known, certainly in the English-speaking world. Yes, Catherine the Great because of all her lovers, Isabella of Spain because of the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. And so I had been talking for so long that I decided that I had to do another video on just this particular happening, this particular event. Okay, so I'm going to join both things today and explain. I'm going to do a putting on you and go back in history, hopefully not to Noah and the Ark, but I have to go back because otherwise it is difficult to understand how that extreme position of absolute hatred between the 2 peoples came about. These situations when there is just visceral hatred for one another doesn't obviously, just happen in one day. So you have to go back to how the whole thing built up and built up and built up until the moment when the Queen in 1492 decided that she had to expel the Jews from Spain. The reason being, she said that in 1492, the official discovery of the New World, the conclusion of the reconquest, of the reconquista of Spain from the Arabs, finished in 1492, and the expulsion of the Jews, 1492 too. And what she said, in order to explain it, in one of the things that the historian said, she said, look, we just finished the war against the Arab invaders, and the way the situation is at the moment in the country, I'm not prepared to start now another war against the Jews. It would not have been a war, not a civil war, it would have been a massacre, as it had been happening anyway. I'm going to take you through all the very ugly things, the burning of synagogues and everything, so I don't want you to think that I'm just going to apologize here for Queen Isabella and what. I'm going to walk you through the horrid crescendo of what started with a resentment, and it built up and it built up and it ended there. And so she said, this is not going to be another civil war. This is going to be a massacre. And so my conclusion at the end, and I will give you the how it happened. I hope I can give you a reasonable explanation of why it all ended up like that, and hopefully you'll stay with me. It's a horrendous history, but what had started with resentment from the lower classes, from the peasants. The ruling class, as I explained in the other video, were okay. There was no problem there. It had been building for centuries, and finally she said, I'm not going to start another war. It will be a massacre. So I'm joining two things here, and this will be the second part of the second part of Queen Isabella. Before I do anything, before I actually start, I have to tell you, of course, why is Spain almost the sole country that is associated with the expulsion of the Jews? The Spanish case was not the only one, or the first in Europe, or indeed the last. But it has been the only one where you will find more historical controversy. The edict was in 1492, the same year, as I said, of the end of the Reconquista. And it's difficult to understand why it's only Spain that is associated with it. If you consider that what happened in Spain was not actually the most massive expulsion, or the last, or even the most violent one. I'm going to take you back, as I said, okay? But as an example of why is it Queen Isabella the only one associated with this horror? It had happened in Europe before. France expelled this religious minority in Europe up, I think, 4 times, okay? Without its history of anti-Semitism or against the Jews becoming so interesting in the popular mind. Because there have been a failure to understand, and a lot of propaganda about the motives, and propaganda has become sort of historiography now, and there the distorted image of Isabella and Ferdinand as irrational fanatics, capable of, because of their hatred, causing the demographic and economic ruin to their kingdom, rather than live together with the Jews. But as I'm going to explain, this is far from reality. Remember also that when that happened, there was in Europe a sort of a common modern applause. The expulsion was signed on the 31st of March 1492 in Granada. And far from the criticisms from foreign historiography afterwards, the decision at the time was seen positively by most Europeans. And actually, and there are documents, half of Europe congratulated the Queen. Even the Sorbonne University in Paris sent in writing their congratulations for her decision. In fact, many of the Jews there at the time had been the descendants of those who had been expelled from France and from England centuries before. Save in Spain, the great kingdoms of Europe had been involved in expulsions since the 12th century. For example, King Philip August of France ordered the confiscation of property and the expulsion of the Jews out of his kingdom in the year 1182. A measure that in the 14th century was done again 3 times, in 1306, in 1321 and in 1394 by different monarchs. The first massive expulsion was that of Edward I of England in the year 1290. So this had happened before. As the Spanish historian Sánchez Albornoz put it, and I quote him, Spain was not more cruel with the Jews than other European countries, but against none have historians shown more rage. Why was that? What was different about this expulsion? What stands out here is how late it took place compared to other countries, and also and this is a very important point, the social importance and preeminence that the Jews had enjoyed in Spain. The reason behind the decision, besides the anger of the common people, that the common people felt towards them, and I will explain how we got to that point, it was more than anger, was doubtless the need to end with the group in power in the country that, in the words of the British historian William Thomas Walsh, unusual for an Englishman, but he said that it was in order to avoid a state within a state. It wasn't just about religion. It was also a political decision here. Although they were exempt, they were not exempt of violent religious episodes. The Jews in Spain had lived with less sudden shocks or scared during the Middle Ages that in other parts of Europe. For example, in the court of Castile, though not so much in Aragon, the Jews actually occupied very important administrative and financial posts. Abraham Senior, that is what the documents say, for example, since 1488, who was the finance minister of the Holy Fraternity, a key body in financing of the war against Granada, the last bastion of Arabic control. His authority this is just one example, his authority in the economy and banking meant also that Jews were the principal lenders in the different Spanish kingdoms, even though by that time their political and financial weight was already in decline. The historian Joseph Perez, in his thesis, shows in his Expulsion of the Jews from Spain that it is false, the premise that the economy of Spain was deeply affected by this edict, based on the published documentation about fiscal and economic activities. But it is doubtless, nevertheless, that the Jews no longer occupied or were the relevant source of wealth that they had been in the past by this time in Castile and in Aragon. Now, the Edict of 1492 established that the Jews had a period of 4 months to leave the country or to become Christians. That was the edict. The emphasis here might seem to be solely on religion, but as in other countries in Europe, what the measure wanted at the end of the day was to unify the kingdom under one same religion at a time when politics and creed were one thing, one same thing. Apart from the fact that in Spain it took place much later than in other European countries, many Europeans believe that many Europeans at the time believed that the measure actually had not been sufficient, because they saw it simply as a measure that was directed more towards forced conversion, which is what they emphasized, the thing that they emphasize, and not the elimination of a religious minority. So from here, you're going to have the continuous insults, actually, against the Spaniards in the 16th century, that they were bad Christians because of their having lived together for centuries with Muslims and with Jews. For example, Pope Paul IV said that, the Spaniards were, strong words, the seed of Jews and Moors and heretics. Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, in 1537 wrote that the Spaniards sunt plerunque marani mamelucan. The majority of Spaniards are marranos, that is, dirty Jews, and dirty Jews and half-breeds. That was Martin Luther. The Edict of 1492 allowed Jews who rejected conversion to take their property with them, but prohibited them from taking gold, silver, arms and horses, which meant, to be fair, that it would be very difficult for them to start easily other businesses in other territories. The large number of refugees did not help either to their being welcome elsewhere with open arms. Another historian Bernaldez wrote, quote, "There was no Christian who did not look at them with pain in their hearts, walking along the highways with much work and misfortune, some falling, others rising, some dying, others being born, others becoming ill." End of quote. Now, at the time of Queen Isabella, always with approximate figures, but most historians agree, the Jews represented about a fifth of the population of their kingdoms, around 200,000. From these, those affected by the edict were about 50,000. About 50,000 never left the peninsula, for they were officially converted. A third came back saying that they had been baptized abroad. Some historians have said that really only about 20,000 left definitely. The Hispanist British historian John Lynch has this figure to be between 40 and 50,000. So the king and queen provided this group expelled from the land with a safety document, safe conduct, demanding respect for them to national and regional authorities and the population at large. The great majority took the unfortunate decision of going to nearby Portugal and Navarre. The north of Spain was still an independent kingdom, because from Spain they were expelled, being able to take their property, although, as I said, not gold or silver, but they were able to take their property, whatever that was. But Portugal accepted them, but then they expelled them without their property a year later, so they lost everything at the end. From Portugal, a great percentage headed for Northern Europe to avoid the massacre in Lisbon of 1506, or the massive deportations from the Portuguese Guinea of Príncipe and Sao Tome. These are two islands, Sao Tome and Príncipe, along with the other few associated little islands. They are located in the Gulf of Guinea, in the southern coast of West Africa, which were reserved for Jews under the Portuguese crown. Some went to Naples, not yet part of the Kingdom of Aragon. There they had a residence permit until 1541, when they were expelled from there. Genoa, which had already prohibited them coming earlier in the past, proceeded to sell them as slaves, those who came to the Republic with no papers. Their fortune in Europe would be nevertheless better than that of those who went to Northern Africa. Quote, in the Maghreb, North Africa, especially in Morocco, many died in the crossing or found slavery in the ships of the Moors, which had made them believe that they would have a safe journey with no problems, wrote the historian Beatrice Leroy. Really, only those who took refuge in the Ottoman Empire, who was already very experienced with Jewish community, they actually helped them. They treated them well, and they would even send Ottoman fleets to the Spanish ports, and the Sultan Bayagiz II allowed the establishment of Jewish communities in all domains of his empire. And he actually sometimes even go and receive them himself. He's quoted to have said, those who have sent them lose, I gain. And until recently, Spain was nevertheless associated with a certain nostalgia, let us say, in the Sephardic community of the Jews, many of whom had maintained a certain link with its culture and language, the Ladino, which is medieval Spanish. But many, of course, that initial hatred towards Spain by many of the Sephardic Jews. The word Sephardic comes from the fact that the name for Spain in the Hebrew is Sepharad. All right. Now, Now, one thing that you might, before I get to the core of my history here, as a preamble also, one thing that you might find very difficult to accept is that in the very early centuries, the Jews were also engaged in proselytizing, a theological word to mean converting others to their religion. This seems very difficult to accept nowadays because we don't see the Jews now going around converting people to Judaism. But that is today. In the very early centuries, they were, as were Christians, as were Muslims. It was a sort of a mini war going on there. And of course the Christians were mandated almost to do so. Jesus had said, go and spread the word throughout, the four corners of the earth and so on. But they were all involved in it. I know that modern historians deny it, but this is so. I'll give you quotes from literature, for example. The Jews did bring their religion to the pagans of the empire, and actively so. The historian, first century, the historian Tacitus, for example, speaks of, quote, many of the Romans of in the empire, many transgressing into the customs of the Jews. Josephus, the Jewish historian, also first century, quote, many Greeks embraced the law in a capital L, yeah. Juvenal, first century, quote, many Romans, leaving the homeland practices of old, learned and observed what Moses taught. We can also go to the woman in Damascus. Most of them were Jewish when Josephus was writing in the first century. In the Acts of the Apostles, we see that in Thessalonica, or Thessaloniki today, that there were a great number of proselytes. True that among the Gentiles this also served for many to embrace Christianity of the Roman pagans. True, assimilating or integrating foreign people was not easy, but due to the confusion of the times, the state of the slave classes, for example, the barbarian invasions and 1,000 other reasons, it did try to attract many, though admittedly not very successfully. Now, let me go now to history. In Spain, let us go back to, I'm going to do a putting on you, let us go back to the Visigoth period, and that is between the 5th and the 8th centuries. That's before Islam. Okay, so we have been invaded throughout the history by just about everybody. The Visigoths from the northern parts, from the barbarian, they were called parts, invaded in the 5th century. Okay, the Visigoths were Arian, and Arian, you remember Arius from the east, he was a Catholic bishop who then denied the divinity of Christ. Therefore the church excommunicated him, and Arianism was from that time onwards a heresy. But it was the first sight that many in the north of Europe, when they came to Arianism, was the first encounter with Christianity that many of the northern people came across. Now, they tried to convert the Catholic population to Arianism. So we had wars there going on, okay? The great majority of the people had been Catholic from the first century, really. We have the poet Prudentius in his hymns singing about how every inch of the soil of Spain is saturated by the blood of martyrs, and so on. So the people did oppose this. Okay, so eventually you had two classes of people, two castes almost. The nobles, the Visigoths, who were Arian, and the rest of the population who were Catholic. Eventually, and this is a long story, they would convert to Catholicism. And some of them so much so that they actually started the first ones to go against the Jews, let me put it that way, with very harsh edicts against them, but not all of them. But the Council of Toledo, the Third Council of Toledo, there were many, many councils of Toledo in the early centuries. There were not councils like the Council of Nicaea, for example, about doctrine, but they were about practice or trying in those early centuries to differentiate between what was Christian and what was pagan, for example. Okay, the church had to deal with that because obviously customs and traditions, die hard. So you see in some of the canons, for example, that they prohibit people going to the top of the hill at 12 midnight carrying candles and dancing and so on. And you read these and you say, what is wrong with going to the top of a hill with a candle and dancing around at midnight? Well, at the time they knew what it was, and the people would have understood that there were pagan practices. So all the councils of Toledo were about this is Christian, this is not, this is pagan, this is okay. So that is why we have so many. I don't know how many, 20. It seems that they were having a council every other day kind of thing. But Council of Toledo III, for example, prohibits the Jews to have Christian concubines and to circumcise or to try to convert their slaves. We are still here with slavery, okay? If they did that, they would, by law, the slaves be freed without compensation to their masters. Then it prohibited the Jews to have Catholic slaves because they saw that it was to them that the Jews would proselytize and try to convert. And this went on until the time of the Visigoth king Sisebutt, 565 to 621, who mandated by law to free the Christian slaves, with an absolute prohibition to be able to purchase Christian slaves from then on. And I could give you the quotes of where the laws are, Law 13 and 14, Article 2, Libro 12, but you're not interested in that. But it was there in the law. So we see by many documents that the Jews at that time were converting or bringing people to their religion. Not so anymore, but they were at that time. And there was as much propagandistic favor among them as it was indeed among the Christians. However, Sisebutt, that Visigoth king, made a terrible mistake. He went too far, as these things always are. He did not stop there. With very little prudence, you might say, and even less wisdom, he enacted a terrible edict which asks the Jews to leave the kingdom or abjure, recant, of their religion. This was the first time a Visigoth king. Well, you know what is going to happen. What happened is obvious. Few accepted exile. So you had these massive conversions, which then the Christians would see them as sacrilege. But to the Jews themselves were, it was not that they were converted, they wouldn't recant their religion, but it was, I'm sure that perhaps they saw it as a bureaucratic, red tape thing. Okay, so if in order to stay and not to be forced into exile, I have to go through this baptism thing with water. Well, that's fine. It doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not going to abandon my religion. So there were a lot of these conversions like that. So the Catholic Church did not approve of I know it's difficult to believe, but the Catholic Church did not approve of Sisebuet's impetuous edict, and in fact actually reproved it in the Toledo Council IV in the year 633, which was presided by Saint Isidore of Seville. Some of you Catholics may have heard of it, firmly establishing that no one should be made to believe by force. It was at the time, go back, okay, so we are in the 7th century now, well before the mass expulsion in 1492. But in the 7th century, of course you cannot force people to be baptized by force. That was the position of the Church. However, there was a problem here. For the Church, a little bit of a tricky point. How to go about with the Jews who had in fact been baptized by force, direct or indirect, but who in secret or in public had relapsed. That is how they understood it. Many of them had become bishops and so on. The problem was, how would the Church deal with those who were Christians but nevertheless went publicly to the synagogues, for example? Okay, it was difficult. You must put yourself in this situation, that the local peasant saw the Catholic bishop going to the synagogue, and so the Church was dealing with this and saying, well, first of all, what bad example. Second, so they were trying to figure out what to do with those who had converted but not really. Okay, how to deal with them. I don't quite understand why they had such a difficult problem, says me here. Because obviously, I'm a Catholic, so the first thing that comes to mind when I see this huge problem of what to do with them is, look, if it is not voluntary, obviously it doesn't count. The person hasn't been baptized. Okay, so I don't understand quite what the problem was here, but anyway. But the Church saw it as apostasy. Theology again. And as apostasy, the Church could obviously not accept open apostasy. In any case, the Church was viewing it not as they were looking at these people not as converts, as it were, but as bad Christians, as it were. That was the problem. Okay, so Sisebuet, by doing this, the king, had acted obviously very badly. The outcome, however, was going to be worse. Another king, Shintila, another of the Visigoth kings, forbids to inhabit in his kingdom anyone who is not Catholic. This is one of the Visigoths who had already sort of converted from Arianism. And so they go and they become more Catholic than the Catholics, so to speak. So he absolutely forbids anyone who's not Catholic to be in the kingdom. Another king, Resisvent, goes even further, enacting laws against those who had relapsed in his views. Now, the Jews who at the time of Sisebuth had left for France came back to, wasn't France at the time, came back to the Narbonne. Another king, Wamba, exiled them again. However, there was already this huge problem going on. The church trying to seek some sort of equilibrium or balance or peace, perhaps, among the different peoples in the councils of Toledo 12 and 13, will go on to grant great privileges to those Jews who did not go back to their religion, to the true conversos. The conversos were the people who had converted to Christianity. But of course, they had to be in plena mentis intentionis, with totally voluntary, knowing what they were doing, and granted them nobility status. And many rose very high up in positions of power and authority. But of course, for most people, it didn't work. The proselytizers were numerous and very rich, and at the time of the King Egica, actually conspired against the security of the state, perhaps in agreement with the Muslims from Africa, and the danger was imminent. That is what the kings were seeing. That king, Egica, and the Toledo Council 17th appeared to come to an extreme decision against the property of the Jews at that time. Now, they confiscated their property. They were seeing that they were helping the Arabs with their invasion. They confiscated their property and a whole other thing. Okay, so the king Witiza had actually become their protector to a great extent. But nevertheless, the Jews decided that in times of King Rodrigo, for example, to facilitate the Arab invasion of Spain by the Muslims or by the Arabs, opening the city gates to the city gates of many cities, for example, Toledo and Cordoba and Seville and Granada. With the Caliphate of Cordoba, this is the golden age for the Jews of Spain. The Arabs invaded. The Arabs were not fanatics. The first invaders were actually people of extreme wealth. What you associate with, the fountains and the luxury and the palaces and that type of life, and they didn't have anything against the Jews, not at first. Okay, so even though they were in power and they were the caliphs, they allowed the Jews a certain amount of authority and power, and in fact the Jews were able to have and run different cities like Seville and many others. Okay, and what happened was that when they were the equivalent of mayors of the city and so on, they kept that city for the Jews only. That was the case with the little town. It's a little town now in Granada called Lucena, but that was exclusively for Jewish people, and if you were not Jewish, you couldn't live there. And many other cities like that, to the point where the Arabs started getting a little bit worried that, hey, we are the ones in power here. You hold on, okay? So there came a point when the Arabs themselves, so the caliphs, were not very comfortable anymore with allowing the Jewish population to run the cities, because they were sort of not allowing anybody else to be there. But in any case, this was the age of the golden age for the Jews of Spain. Rabbi Moshe, I'm going to say Rabbi rather than Rabbi, Rabbi Moshe and Rabbi Hanok bring to Cordoba then the Eastern Academies of learning from the East. Rabbi Joseph ben Hasdai, a doctor, actually a relative of the Caliph Abderrahman III, and he was also a minister. He would openly work and to protect and advance his own people. At the same time that because of all these facilities, their wealth and industry would grow and flourish. And here we have very learned people, the predecessors of, for example, the philosophers and Talmudists and poets, the predecessors of even more illustrious masters that would come afterwards, such as Gabirol and Ben Ezra and Yehuda Levi and Abraham ben David and Maimonides, etc. There were towns exclusively Jewish, such as I said, Lucena in Granada, which enjoyed a great deal of learning and prosperity. However, what happened afterwards was that there was a second invasion by the Arabs, and these ones were different. Remember, we are talking about perhaps 100 years after after Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, Islam, and so on. So these ones were different. They were called the Almohads. I don't know what the equivalent is today, but the Almohadis, I don't know how else to pronounce it. And anyway, these were members of the Berber Muslims from North Africa. And they were extreme in their, Christians were not the only ones. They were also quite extreme, and they actually went about forcing Jews to abandon Judaism and convert to Islam. So we were all kind of doing it a little bit, okay? But the dilemma for the Jews now, having enjoyed such great prosperity and freedom, was the choice that they were given by these Arabs. The other Arabs were become Muslims or death. And there were massacres. People from Africa, they razed and burned down synagogues. So at that time, the Jews were obviously in danger. So they left Andalusia, they left the south, and came up towards Christian Spain, to Toledo, in the center of Spain. Okay, and they transferred their academies to Toledo. the academies that had been in Seville and in Cordoba, and now these academies came to Toledo under the protection of the Christian king, Alfonso VII. Others sought refuge in Catalonia, northeast, or even in France. But for a time there was a period of relative peace, or let's say tolerance, save a few exceptions, for example in 1212. Because the King Alfonso, called King Alfonso the Wise, was trying to bring together Christian, Jews and Muslims, those the Christians in the Caliphate together, the Muslims of Andalusia, together with, helped by the Archbishop of Toledo. The Jews at this stage, having come from Arab lands to the Christian lands, continued proselytizing though, and that was going to create a problem. So now we're beginning to see the beginning of extremism, as it were, as if it hadn't happened before, which it had to a large extent, but now it's becoming worse and worse and worse all the time until we get to 1492. For example, in the laws of Valencia, King Jaime the Conqueror, he says that any Christian converted to Judaism would be condemned to the flames. So that's the Christians who were converting to Judaism, condemned to the flames. Nevertheless, he does send Christian preachers to the synagogues to bring Jews to the Christian faith, and actually makes it possible for the Dominicans and the Franciscans to learn Hebrew and Arabic. And he authorizes in 1263 and in 1265 the beginning of very important debates between Christians and Jews. The most famous ones are debates in Barcelona, but these were between Christians and Jews, obviously, but the ones who were holding the Christian banner were actual Jews, conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity. I'm going to give you an example of how this was done. In these theological debates in 1263 and 1265 in Barcelona, there is, we have Rabbi Mose ben Nachman, Rabbi ben Astroch de Porta, Pablo Cristia himself. They were, Then Alfonso the Wise, in another law, after punishing the Christians who turned Jews with death at the flames, also prohibits Jews to, quote, lay with Christian women or to have baptized servants, punishment of death in the first and losing your servants now in the second. The populace accused the Jews of unheard of crimes and profanations. One of the legislators writes, "We have heard say that in some places the Jews did and still do remembrance of the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ on Good Friday by stealing children and mocking them on a cross, and by making wax images of the cross and simulating a crucifixion when they do not have children." Other writers point to the same happenings in Toledo and so on. Okay, so this is going on, the scene changes in the 14th century. The prosperity of the Jews was due mainly to commerce and mechanics. And there was another problem here. Look, the Christians were fighting the reconquest, from the Arabs, and they were advances. They had been advancing from the north all the way, Andalusia in the south remained Arabic for a long time. And this fight, this struggle, this battle, this war had been going on and off since the 711 when they first invaded. Now, what happened here and what started a lot of resentment from the peasants was the fact that if you were a Christian, you had to go to the front, as it were, to fight that war against the Arabs. You felt it as your patriotic duty, but also in those days, remember, church and state were kind of the same. You created a nation like that. So sacrilege was, like high treason to your country, if we can go back to the mentality of those days. So it was your moral obligation to go and fight the Arabs for the reconquest of your country. The Jews did not have to do that because they were not Christians. And it was as if they were in Spain but not of Spain, as it were. So no one forced them to go and fight. Many did, but they didn't have to go. And because of a very old law in the books, if you left your plot of land fallow unattended for over the period of a year, the government could sell it. They could just sell your land. So the practical situation here was that you went to fight for your country. And when you put yourself in the mind of an ordinary peasant, when you came back, your land was gone. Who bought it? Who sold it? Well, the government sold it. Who bought it? The local Jew. He could do that. He was there. They were not purchasing it illegally. It was the law that was bad, not taking into account that this law had to be changed. The people were going to fight, and when they came from the war, they were destitute. And what they saw was the local Jew who owned their land, who would give them credit, and it is true that the rates of interests were up to 1,000, because there is a law saying explaining this, but also that at one point of time that if you were not Christian, you could not charge more than 250% interest. The interest rates were extremely high. So, and then at the same time, you saw perhaps the local bishop going to the synagogue. And so, you don't quite, you're wondering what on earth is going on here. The problem at this point was not the Jews who were purchasing the land. They were doing that legally. The problem was that the upper classes, always they disconnected from the populace, did not realize that law had to be changed. And it went on for centuries like this, and they wouldn't change it. So from the local people, this resentment against the Jews, which would end up in visceral hatred. But at the moment, it was just, some people say envy. Well, yeah, okay, envy. if you like. But it was, it started with resentment, unaddressed. So what happened? Well, what do you expect to happen? Violence started. Violence started first in Aragon and Navarre. The so-called shepherds of the Pyrenees, I don't know whether they were shepherds or were just called that. I mean, the shepherds tend to be a sort of a pacific, calm, nice people, I suppose, but they were called the shepherds of the Pyrenees. More than 30,000 of them started a rampage in the south of France first, coming to the border towns of Spain. Pope Clement V excommunicated them because of what they had done, which was horrific. Didn't change things. That horde of bandits, which is what they were, entered Navarre in 1321, setting fire to all the alhamas. Alhamas is the Jewish quarters, the alhamas of Pamplona and other towns, killing, knifing any Jew that they came across. They were bandits, basically. Alfonso, the Prince of Aragon, put an end to it best he could. But the people of Navarre continued on with that bad example in other small towns. Just to give you an idea of how horrific this was, more than 10,000 Jews were killed. In 1360, again, Jewish blood is shed in many other towns, another rampage all over the place. And then we have a deacon, Hernán Martínez. He started preaching in he was not terribly bright, but anyway, Santa Maria, who was a converso and also was going to be the first inquisitor, said of him, "Laudabitis vitae and literatura simplex." He didn't have much learning, although his life was a pious, apparently, life. Okay, so the Alhama Barrio in Seville issued complaints, numerous complaints, to King John II, the first, of the preaching of this Hernán Martínez, this deacon, who was a fanatic. And he did stop for a while, but, quotes the historian, he continued motivating the people to destroy the synagogues. So the Archbishop, Pedro Gómez Barroso, declared him, quote, rebel and suspect of heresy himself, forbidding him to preach without a license. But upon the death of the Archbishop and the see being vacant for a while, he came back, that Hernán Martínez guy, he came back to preaching and actually clamored for the destruction of the synagogues of small towns, while the King's Guards actually resisted and put a stop to it. In the year of 1391, of sad remembrance, the people of Seville, listening to his speeches, assaulted the Jewish quarters, destroying a great number of synagogues and the death of approximately 4,000 Jews. The numbers are horrific, as you can imagine, in a small population. So, obviously, the same thing as before. Some are going to ask to be baptized. You want to live. You want to, self-preservation and so on. amidst all this, there was a voice, Saint Vincent Ferrer. Catholics, you might have heard of him, who was actually venerated by many Jews because he was a very, very strong voice at the time, preaching against violence, preaching against hatred of the Jews. He's a saint now, but he managed, especially in Valencia, he managed to contain the slaughter. Historians tell us that many Jews would actually, when he passed by, they would actually go down on their knees in showing respect for him, gratitude, I suppose. Soon after, it was the Alhambra of Toledo, but nowhere, historians tell us, was more intense than in Barcelona, where not a stone remained. No one Jew was left alive. Chancellor Ayala says greed to steal and not devotion was what caused it, obviously. And it was greed, he said, that had incited this blood orgy. But it spread, and it spread to Mallorca, and it spread throughout Aragon and Castile. And what is worse, some of these scandals and these rampages remained unpunished. Apart from those who actually were converted by Saint Vincent Ferrer, who is called the protector of the Jews in Valencia, of course, they would convert, but they would, because of self-preservation, I would have done the same, But of course, they were Jewish and they were practicing their religion. But some people started saying that these conversos were people without God or law, who had been bad Jews because they had recanted of their religion, and they were still worse Christians. So this is what is going on. Some actually did convert. Learned people did convert. And it was learned people, as a matter of fact, who actually studied Christianity in earnest. And no one is going of these conversos who truly believed in Christianity. No one exceeded them in zeal, sometimes very harsh zeal, against their own, than Pablo de Santa Maria. I want you to remember this, because Pablo de Santa Maria, his name was Selemoch Ha Levi, from Burgos, the province of Burgos, who had been converted by St. Vincent Ferrer. And he's going to be the first inquisitor. And he was going hard against those who pretended to be Christians. I can understand that. Okay, but he would go very hard against them. Now, to accelerate the conversion of the Jews, Pedro de Luna, Pope Benedict XIII, in the Tortosa, a Tortosa Theological Congress, promoted debates where the converso Jerónimo de Santa Fe, who would be another inquisitor, the first two, his name was Yeshua Ha-Lorki, held in January of 1413 a debate between him and 14 rabbis from Aragon on debates on the fulfillment of messianic prophecies. Because these conversos were very learned in the Jewish faith, and then they proceeded to study Christianity. They became very good at debates, obviously, because they knew both, as it were. And in this particular one, in 1413, all the rabbis except two became Christians. The two that did not were Rabbi Joseph Albo and Rabbi Ferrer, no relation. This made the news and was followed by many others, debates and conversions in Aragon. They were following the example of other doctors, for example, Per Alfonso, who in the 12th century wrote his dialogues against, quote, against the impious opinions of the Jews. He had been a Jew, but many of them were writing this. Against the impious opinions of the Jews, that was the book, and of Rabbi Abner, who took the name Alfonso de Valladolid, okay, Rabbi Abner, who at the beginning of the 14th century actually shows his knowledge of scripture in his books. He has one book on the battles of God, on justice, another book, on the book of the three graces, another book. Another converso, Santa Fe, Yeshua HaLorki, as I said, wrote another very influential book, Hebrew Mastics. And Santa Maria, another convert, wrote Scriptunium Scripturarum, where he shows his learning of scripture and arguing for Christianity. And when he was elevated to be the Chancellor of Castile, he enacted a very severe law in 1412 to imprison Jews and Arabs and Muslims. The Spanish society as a whole welcomed the conversos, believing that their conversion was true. So Santa Maria in Castile, and Santa Fe, these two gentlemen in Aragon, there was another one, Sant'Angel, another one, Caballeria, achieved the highest positions of church and state. Rich and influential, now they intermarried with the nobility. And this was important. This is a very important thing, because much later is going to give rise to a frightening reaction, horrific reaction, which did not end until well into the 17th century. And this is really quite disgusting, this internal race war, which was to prove one of the, many say, the main causes of Spanish decadence, although some say that not so much, but in any case there is historians disagree on this. But the fusion was almost complete. You had in opposition what people saw the infidelity of these new Christians now, they were called new Christians, who in secret would continue to observe the Jewish law and tradition and religion on the one hand, and on the other, and at the same time, there was these suspicions that the population had on all the Jews. It wasn't all the Jews. Some of them became very zealot against their own people. But the the population didn't seem to be able to distinguish. Okay. Sometimes, in order to prove that they were no longer Jewish, because the population said, well, if you were, then you still are, you're one of those. No, in order to prove that they were no longer so, and others for authentic fervor, more or less extreme, lost, the conversos showed themselves, some of these conversos showed themselves implacable enemies of their race and religion. Cavalleria, for example, in his book Celus Christi, and Spina, another inquisitor, in his Fortalitium Fidei, which is actually a book quite, historians tell us, quite salient for its apologetics, and is a treasure of historical anecdotes and so on. As the new Christians nevertheless continued to increase their wealth or maintain their relationships, commerce and leases from the government, the hatred from the populace, from the multitudes, turned towards them, the old hatreds. Because the Jews were also very much involved in tax collection, for example, and tax collectors have never been very popular anywhere, but there you go. The rest of the population turned against them now, and the first spark of this fire was the rampage of the people of Toledo in 1449, led by Father Sarmiento and another academic, Marquillos. Sarmiento he had been raised to the mayor of Toledo, would strip away, and he had been Jewish, he would strip away by an edict on the 5th of June that the conversos of every public office, they wouldn't have been able, the Jews would no longer serve in public office, calling them suspects about the faith. This edict was immediately made null and void, but the seed again remained, and it is from this seed that the later sort of cleansing statutes were based. In the meantime, Spina, a previous Jew, complained in his Fortalitium, that book. He complained about the multitude of conversos, of new Christians who were not really Christians, who were apostates and so on, going very harshly against them. He was probably the first one, actually, that wrote about them. And he proposed that an investigation should take place. That is, an investigation, the word in its original meaning is Inquisition, an inquiry. The word means inquiry, but he is the first one who proposes it. An investigation, that is, an inquisition, be carried out in the kingdoms of Castile against the new Christians, his old co-religionists. Spina actually devoted his life to destroy what he considered secret Judaism. He was absolutely livid about it. He spoke of Jewish infection. I mean, language like this. For him, and these were the words he used, for him it was clear and it was real In the words of Alonso de Oropesa, defender of the unions of all Christians, in his Lumen Dei ad Revelationem Gentium, which has never actually been published, but the historian, this is particular historian that I'm following here, tells us that it is to be found in a codex at the Ambrosiana Library in Milan. So he carried out an investigation in Toledo and found that Alfonso de Oropesa, this historian, this investigator, found that, quote, there is blame on both sides. All Christians sin against, and they are daring, reckless, and rogues. And that is the old Christians. And the new Christians also sin of malice and fickleness in the faith. End of quote. So now you can see that things are degenerating very rapidly. There are riots in Toledo in July and August of 1467. There are riots against the Jews in Cordoba in 1473. Other cities, Jaén in the south, in Andalusia, Segovia in Castile in 1474. This living together between the what are now called the old and the new Christians was now becoming impossible. It was becoming a war, a massacre, really. The word was now that these fake Christians, they would be called, were all suspicious. Quote, who would not even want to hide their contempt for the faith, and nevertheless occupied positions in the church curia, that is the highest position of authority, as well as in government. The problem here was between those who now publicly the populace so out of contempt for their faith would openly and publicly, sometimes priests, sometimes bishop, would continue in their old faith. And of course people saw it as mockery. Are you mocking my religion? I've just come from the war. We were dying for it. Do you understand how the hatred is beginning now? Now they would do it. The people saw that they were doing openly for everyone to see, so they felt that they were mocking them. That's so. On Holy Thursday in 1478 in Seville, again there are the documents. Six of these new Christians, or fake Christians, were discovered actively blaspheming against the faith. Anyway, all this was leading to an active investigation. You can see where all this is leading. These new investigators or inquisitors started by applying. It had been going on already in Aragon and other individual sort of kingdoms, and now it was going to be a national one. So they were going to copy that, what was going on, the line of inquiry in Aragon. On the 6th of February 1481, 6 people were condemned as guilty and sent to the flames in the small town of Tablada. The same year, 1481, was published an edict of grace, calling to repentance and reconciliation all those that knew to be guilty. In other words, an amnesty, so to speak. More than 20,000 embraced this amnesty. So they had been, anyway, they took advantage of the amnesty, obviously. So, was it, the historian here asks, was it a fantasy or not, this fear of apostasy? Because among them, you see, there were many who had become, as I said, priests and friars and nuns and people in public office. What to do in this religious conflict, and as they were seen, domestic enemies. What do you do now? The survival instinct took over, so to say. And to save, by whichever means, the religious unity and social unity of the country, and to do away with this uncertainty and always suspicious, where you could not, in the eyes of the people, you could not distinguish between the faithful from his enemies, or friend from traitor, as they saw it. They started now an official inquisition, an official investigation. On the 11th of February 1482, the king and queen obtained from the Pope a bull by Sixtus IV to establish this council of investigation. And the president, now nationwide, would be Fray Tomás de Torquemada, you have heard the name, who was the prior of the Santa Cruz monastery in the city of Segovia. He had also been Jewish. Not directly, actually, his grandparents were. So what you see here is that the four, the one in Aragon, the one in Castile, the one in Catalonia, and then the national one, they had all been Jewish before. The new tribunal, which was going to be different from the others in Catalonia and Valencia. Different because it was an official thing, it was better organized, and it was going to be independent of episcopal jurisdiction. And when that is, independent, that already tells you there are going to be problems here, because you certainly have to have a hierarchy or something to be accountable to someone, yeah. But when you are independent of episcopal jurisdiction, you can see how things are going to go from bad to worse. But in any case, this official inquisition would also be introduced as an official inquisition in Aragon 2 years later. Now, the New Christians of Zaragoza, probably fearing it and perhaps a little bit in bad conscience, on the 18th of September 1485, killed one of the inquisitors, Pedro Arbues, when he was in church at prayer. There is a Green Book of Aragon, so-called, with the name of all the indicted. In this trial, most of the New Christians in Aragon were found involved. Historian Llorente cites that between 1481 and 1498, 10,220 people were burned. However, a lot of other historians point to this number being incorrect. Why? Because he provides no evidence. The actual documents in Aragon show 69. The official register in Catalonia shows 25. Llorente's figures have been shown to be wrong without any doubt. For example, he gives in 481, he says that there were 2,000, but these were counts in all the different years up to that point. Anyway, historians have said that number is incorrect. And also, instead of providing the evidence, he constantly refers to the words approximately or more or less or the same as in previous years and things like that. So it's not a historical document. Okay, so look, it cannot... So anyway, so you see where we are. So in 1492, then the king and queen decides to enact an edict to expel the Jews from Spain. As I said before, I don't think that the queen, how can I put this? The actual expulsion, I don't think it can be good or bad. I think it was by this time a realistic political decision, because things had gotten so out of hand that, as she said, and I said at the very beginning, what she said in 1492 was, we have just finished a long war of centuries, we are not going to start another one. And somehow they didn't know how to change the situation. The hatreds were so implanted now. It was, had they changed that law, that you couldn't have your land back, perhaps things would have gone differently. But as I said, it started with resentment. You say envy, well, perhaps envy, whatever it was, but it could have been managed earlier on. At this point, they just wanted to kill each other. So I think what the queen did was, look, this is the solution. Because it's not going, as she said, it's not going to be a war, it's going to be one more massacre. And each time the massacre gets worse. I think she just took a realistic view of the situation. So more or less, in summary, I would say it cannot be denied that there was among the Jews a proselytizing, yes. This, of course, is not. This is common, certainly in those days, common to all faiths. Okay, but there are innumerable legal documents, starting with the canons of Toledo, all the way to the documents of imprisonment of the Middle Ages, and even the edict of expulsion of 1492. The Jewish influence is evident from, it was not only the Jewish religion, but also the pantheistic philosophy from the 12th century that many Jews were expounding. In Spain, the main person was Gundisalvo. The spread of the Kabbalah in theory and in practice. And the problem with this is that this name was given to also certain superstitions and prohibited magic arts, and all that was mixed in the Cavalier of the day. And certain forced conversions would end up in certain practices that, of course, would end up in apostasy and sometimes sacrileges, which reached their climax at the time of Isabella and Ferdinand. What we see is that, yes, a great number of those accused by the Inquisition were relapsed, and some of them, a lot of them, were actual active enemies of Christianity. That's true enough. But there were also many who were true Christians. Okay, some of them were just lying, pretending. But some of them were actually people who, throughout the years, were true Christians, as it were, but nevertheless reserved customs and traditions of old which were not hurting anybody. In other words, it takes so long to change your traditions and your customs and all that sort of thing. They may have been Christians, but they still kept certain things from their tradition, and they might not have even be aware that they were doing anything wrong at all, and those were in the middle. Perhaps many, perhaps even the majority of them. The problem is that the rigor imposed on this, who were not really guilty, was certainly counterproductive and served to that permanent division without reconciliation. We had reached the point where reconciliation was impossible, and that continued on even after the expulsion took place. So, as I said, as for the Queen, you can see that she didn't just, thought, well, I hate these people, so let me expel them. It's complicated. Things got out of hand. And there we are. I don't know how to put it. The bad taste remains to a large extent. Even today, there was something about the hatred. The Spaniards had fought the Arabs from 711 until 1492, on and off for 800 years before all of them were expelled from Spain. But nevertheless, they don't hate. The Spanish people don't hate the Arab people. They just saw them as, we are at war, But there is no lingering bad taste against them at all. With the Jews, it was a little different because the people felt that they had betrayed them. That obviously putting the blame onto them, it cannot possibly be the case, but they felt that they had done very well. And nevertheless, they used it. Certainly at the very beginning, it was obvious that when they were allowed, they would keep the cities for themselves and no one else would be allowed there. And so people began to distrust them, and they saw them as people who I don't know, were only interested in themselves and not they were not of the nation, not for the whole nation, as it were, but whenever they could, they would take it for themselves. I think of the Jewish people as perhaps the first immigrants or migrants to the word Jew. Actually, the root of the word in Hebrew means pilgrim. In other words, people on the move, not necessarily nomadic, but people always on the move. And although they prospered in Spain, they would, people felt that they would keep that for themselves and not for the nation. Hence, what I said at the very beginning, that the political solution was to obviously also try to avoid a state within a state, which was what seemed to be the outcome of it. Anyway, terrible history. But there you are. That is how they came to be expelled from Spain. Thank you for your attention. This is a very difficult subject, and it's not at all very difficult. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.